Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting to something pretty provocative.
Yeah.
The idea that a modern Islamic state isn't just, hard to pull off,
Right.
but that it's actually impossible, like a contradiction in terms. That's what the scholarship we're looking at argues.
It's a strong claim, definitely. Yeah. And this deep dive, it really draws on some rigorous, detailed analysis, historical perspectives. Yeah. It challenges a lot of assumptions, both about Islamic governance and about what a modern state even is.
Right. And hopefully you'll come away understanding why there's this real struggle for modern Muslims trying to fit together the state's power, which is undeniable with the need for Shari.
Exactly.
So our mission here is to give you that shortcut, that deep understanding of a really vital topic. It connects to these, core moral issues that modernity faces everywhere, East and West.
It really does.
So yeah, hopefully you'll connect some dots today. Let's dive in. So this whole journey starts with this central tension. Modern Muslims, the source says, are caught between two things. Mm-hmm. On one side, you've got the modern state. It just is. Yeah. Its power is real, tangible. The source calls it the ontological fact of the state.
Right, it's just there, unavoidable.
Exactly. And then on the other side, there's the deontological fact, the moral need, the ought for Shari governance based on Islamic principles.
And it's not just a practical puzzle, is it? It's presented as a really deep dilemma.
Absolutely.
And what's really striking, I think, is how the source material connects this specific problem, the impossibility of Islamic governance today, to wider moral difficulties that are just part of modernity itself.
So it's not just an Islamic issue.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's framed as a symptom of a broader modern condition, something affecting Western cultures too.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we need this concept. The source uses paradigm.
Right.
Think of it like a society's operating system, a central domain that kind of dictates how everything else works.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Like the source gives examples. 19th century technical progress. It became almost a religion, didn't it?
A religion of technical miracles, yeah.
And it shaped morals, politics, economics, everything. Or, the Enlightenment, making critical reason the absolute center. That's another paradigm.
So the central value kind of bleeds into everything else.
Precisely. In a traditional religious society, maybe moral upbringing was the central thing.
Okay.
Shift to a technical age, and suddenly it's all about economic and technical progress. Or an economic age where maybe focusing on production makes moral questions seem secondary or even irrelevant.
Right. There's this constant interplay, this dialectic between the center and the edges.
Exactly. The core values shape the subsidiary ones.
So how does Shari's fit into this paradigm idea, historically speaking?
Well, historically, Sharia was that central moral paradigm in many Islamic societies. It permeated daily life, even the messy parts.
Yeah, the source is clear. It wasn't some utopia. You still had, corruption, crime.
Overtaxed peasants, dodgy judges, all of that. But the structure itself, the Sharia, was aimed at a moral end. It provided the overarching framework.
Okay, so it was the dominant moral system.
And this is really key. Well, the institutions, the courts, the schools, based on Sharia, were often dismantled or replaced by Western laws during colonialism and after.
Right.
The psychological and spiritual side of Shari endured. Think of the pillars of Islam. They still define Muslim identity for millions.
So even if the official structures are gone.
The memory, the feeling, the resource of Sharia as a moral guide is still very much alive.
Now, people often hear this kind of talk and just dismiss it, right? Oh, that's just nostalgia, wanting to go back to some golden age.
Exactly. But the source pushes back hard on that. It argues that the charge of nostalgia isn't neutral. It often comes wrapped up in its own ideology, the ideology of modern progress.
Ah, okay. So the idea of progress itself prevents looking back.
Pretty much. This doctrine of progress, the source says, inherently excludes views that don't fit its narrative. It makes certain kinds of historical retrieval seem illegitimate from the start.
And the kicker is?
The kicker is that this very idea of linear progress is itself a product of a specific time and place. It's not some universal truth. To treat it as such is, historically short-sighted.
Okay, that's a powerful critique. Let's shift then to the other side of the equation, the modern state. What is it, according to this analysis?
Well, first off, it's not timeless or universal. The source is very clear. It's a specific thing born out of historical contingency.
Meaning it just happened to develop in a certain way.
Mostly in Euro-America initially, and then it got exported everywhere else. It's an invention, not an inevitability.
And what's at its core?
Sovereignty. This concept is absolutely central. The modern state, embodied by the nation, sees itself as the sole author of its own destiny. It makes its own rules.
Often born out of revolution, right? Breaking from a king or tyrant.
Yes, like the American and French revolutions. And this self-declared sovereignty needs recognition from other sovereign states. That's the international system.
And crucially, violence.
Crucially, yes. The state's power relies, ultimately, on its monopoly on legitimate violence, or at least the credible threat of it, both internally to enforce its laws and externally to defend itself.
So the state becomes this godlike lawgiver.
In effect, yes. It creates the law, it owns the law, it enforces the law through its sovereign will.
And this connects to bureaucracy, doesn't it? Max Weber's ideas.
Absolutely. Weber's concept of rational bureaucratic domination is key here. This isn't traditional authority. It's deliberately created voluntarism and systematic.
Calculable, standardized, impersonal rules.
Exactly. And Weber, and the source building on him, points out how this bureaucracy just grows and grows. It becomes almost indestructible.
Regulating everything. Birth, death, marriage, work.
Everything. And in doing so, it doesn't just manage society. It actively produces particular kinds of people, particular subjectivities.
Yeah. Which leads to this idea of cultural penetration.
Right. The modern state doesn't just coexist with older social structures, families, communities, guilds, whatever. It tends to break them down or remake them in its own image.
It asserts power over society, not with society.
Precisely. Its own authority, its own laws, its bureaucracy, its violence. That's what it recognizes. Everything else has to conform.
Okay, so we have this picture of a very powerful, self-justifying, bureaucratic, and culturally invasive modern state. Now, what about the checks and balances we usually hear about? Separation of powers, legislative, executive, judicial.
Yeah, the classic textbook model. But the source argues that in reality, especially with the modern administrative state, that separation is largely broken down.
How so?
Well, think about administrative agencies, environmental protection, financial regulation, you name it. They often write rules, legislative, enforce them, executive, and adjudicate disputes about them, judicial. Sometimes all within the same agency, even the same people.
So much for separation.
Right. The source points out that even legal scholars admit the theory is confusing, riddled with exceptions, basically a failure in practice.
And some critics, like Kelsen mentioned in the source, say it's not really separation anyway.
Exactly. Kelsen argued it's more about distribution. The legislature doesn't make all the general rules. The executive issues orders, regulations. The judiciary sets precedents through interpretation. They all, in a sense, legislate.
But doesn't distributing power risk concentrating it somewhere else?
That's the concentricity problem the source talks about.
Oh.
Ironically, trying to distribute power can end up funneling more power towards the executive, weakening the legislature.
Which then makes you question the whole idea of rule of law and democracy, if power is actually concentrating like that.
It definitely raises serious questions about how modern states actually function versus how we think they function.
Okay, so that's the modern state side. Now, let's contrast that sharply with Islamic governance as presented in the source. What's the fundamental difference?
The absolute starting point, sovereignty. In the Islamic model described, God alone is sovereign. Humans don't create the ultimate law or morality.
So human authority, like the community reaching a consensus, is always interpretive.
Interpretive, yes. And bound by universal moral principles that are seen as existing independently of human will or control. A totally different foundation from the state making itself sovereign.
And what about the ruler, the executive?
Critically, the ruler, the sultan, caliph, whatever the title stands, under the Sharia. Not above it.
So the law limits the ruler, not the other way around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Executive intervention in society or lawmaking was generally the exception, and it facilitating individual welfare. And the individual's ultimate accountability was to God, not the state.
The source also paints a really interesting picture of the jurists and judges. Not like today's legal professionals necessarily.
No, much more grassroots. They often came from ordinary backgrounds, lived within their communities, were teachers, merchants.
Public leaders almost.
Yes, and importantly, they often took the initiative to help the oppressed or resolve disputes. And the fatwa was central.
The non-binding legal opinion from a scholar?
Right. Disputes were often settled based on fatwas, which then got collected into influential legal texts. It wasn't all about formal court precedents like today. This suggests a much wider diffusion of legal knowledge.
A living and lived tradition of moral law.
That's the phrase used, yeah. And this leads to a fascinating point about judicial independence.
How so? It sounds like rulers could appoint and dismiss judges quite easily.
They could, and they did. But paradoxically, because judges often had other jobs, other sources of income, and this turnover was seen as somewhat normal.
They weren't solely dependent on the state job for their livelihood.
Exactly. Which counterintuitively could make them more independent in their commitment to upholding Shari compared to a modern system where judicial careers are tied to the state apparatus.
That really challenges the stereotype of Oriental despotism, doesn't it?
Completely. The source argues that because rulers governed from outside the law, in a sense they didn't create Shari. Their tyranny, when it occurred, didn't necessarily corrupt the core legal and moral fabric of the community itself.
The community was primary, politics secondary.
That seems to be the conception, yes. The community's integrity was paramount. So while rulers had duties, like enforcing Shari judgments, what's called siyasa sharia.
Okay.
The fundamental paradigm was moral accountability to God and the community, not the state working for its own power and perpetuation.
This difference feels rooted in something even deeper philosophically. You mentioned the ISOT split earlier. Can we unpack that?
Yeah, this is crucial for understanding modernity. Thinkers like Hobbes, Austin the legal positivist, they argued strongly that law as it is, the rules on the books, has no necessary connection to law as it ought to be, morality, justice.
Facts versus values.
Exactly. And this split is foundational to the Enlightenment project, which elevates human reason operating independently as the ultimate judge. It leads to what's called instrumentalism, viewing the world, rules, even people as just tools or means to an end, stripped of inherent moral value.
But the source mentions thinkers who challenged this split. McIntyre, Taylor.
Right. They argue, and the source agrees, that this sharp ISOT divide isn't a universal truth about reality. It's a historical development, a feature of modern thought.
And pre-modern Islam didn't have this split.
Not in the same way. The source argues there wasn't this sharp line between moral and legal. The Quran itself presents a cosmos grounded in moral realities, almost moral natural laws.
Where life is a test, actions have consequences.
And the goal is to promote good and prevent evil. Belief in Islam isn't just mental assent. It inherently demands good works. Morality permeates the entire Shari. It's a legal system, yes, but fundamentally an ethical project.
So the law itself is meant to be morally grounded?
Deeply so, which contrasts sharply with the modern state's often value-neutral, positivist approach to law.
Okay, this is leading towards a really fascinating contrast in how these systems shape the actual person, the self.
Absolutely. This might be the most profound difference.
How does the modern state shape us, according to the analysis?
Mostly through external means. Surveillance police, cameras, data collection, coercion prisons, penalties, mandatory education systems that instill certain values, welfare systems that create dependency.
The goal being?
To produce a docile subject. Someone compliant, useful, motivated by submission and utility. It creates what the force calls an exteriorized personality, shaped from the outside in.
Okay, so that's the state's approach. What's the contrast in the Islamic model described?
It emphasizes what are called technologies of the self, drawing on thinkers like the famous scholar Al-Ghazali. The focus shifts inward.
Internal mastery.
Yes, mastery over the self, the body, the soul. Seeking detachment from purely material concerns. Prioritizing moral and spiritual growth.
And the 5 pillars of Islam fit into this.
They are presented as the core practical method. The Shahada, faith declaration, Salah, prayer, Zakat, almsgiving, Psalm, fasting, Hajj, pilgrimage. They aren't just disconnected rituals.
They're training.
Exactly. They're structured, performative acts that work together to shape the whole person, body, mind, soul. They instill moral accountability, connection to God, connection to community.
You mentioned Naya earlier, intention. That's key here.
Hugely important. It's the inner state, the sincere intention behind the act that gives it its spiritual weight. It's a deep psychological component.
And things like zakat, the charity.
It's framed not just as charity, but as purifying wealth, removing its potential moral burden, affirming the poor's God-given right to a share. It's like a financial ablution.
In fasting.
Taming the body's base desires, yes, but also fostering empathy and social discipline. Connecting your personal feeling of deprivation to the needs of the wider community. It builds solidarity.
This reminds me of Ghazali's view of human nature you mentioned.
Right, Ghazali saw humans as very malleable, with these potentials aggressive, animalistic, satanic, but also divine, represented by the intellect.
And the intellect's job is to guide the others.
Precisely. Ethical conduct isn't automatic. It has to be cultivated through training, through practice. The pillars provide that program, that efficacy.
And it's driven more by love than fear.
Ideally, yes. Ghazali emphasized that love of God arising from inner perception and spiritual insight is a much stronger and more authentic motivator for true Naya than just fearing punishment.
Wow. So when you put these two pictures side by side,
They seem fundamentally incompatible, don't they?
yeah, the exteriorized personality of the modern citizen focused on efficiency, productivity, national loyalty, maybe economic worth.
Stands in what the source calls irreconcilable contradiction with the moral subject aimed for in Islamic governance.
A subject defined by the unity of is and ought, responsible to God and community, living for a higher purpose.
It's a clash of basic orientations towards life, selfhood, and the world.
Okay, so if these two systems, the modern state and the Islamic governance model, are already in such tension, what happens when you throw globalization into the mix?
Well, globalization kind of cuts both ways, according to the sources. On one hand, it definitely challenges the power and autonomy of individual nation states, creating transnational flows of capital, information, people.
Tell me that again.
On the other hand, globalization is also deeply shaped by states. Think about international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO. They're created and largely controlled by powerful states. So the state is both challenged and enabled by globalization.
And how does this impact the moral dimension, particularly concerning economics?
This is where the clash becomes really sharp. The source argues that traditional Islamic moral values, which supported commerce but within ethical boundaries like the five universals, protecting life, religion, intellect, lineage, and property for the community's benefit,
Right.
are just fundamentally at odds with modern global capitalism, especially the logic of large corporations focused solely on profit maximization.
Modern economics often pits growth against social justice, right?
Often, yes. Whereas the Islamic perspective described promotes both. Wealth is seen as a trust from God, and the poor have a right to a share woven into the economic system itself, like through zakat.
And this relates to what you said about Islamic banking.
Exactly. The critique is that many modern Islamic financial institutions might follow the technical rules, like avoiding interest, but they often lack the deeper embeddedness in those technologies of the self, that whole moral ecosystem that historically shaped economic behavior.
So it risks being superficial.
It risks missing the holistic ethical framework, yes.
And beyond economics, there's a cultural clash, too.
A huge one. The modern state, amplified by global media and markets, tends to promote a culture that's often materialistic, hedonistic, individualistic.
Narcissistic, the source says.
Yes. And crucially, a culture that constantly reinforces that separation of morality from facts, from science, from law, from business. This makes it incredibly difficult for a morally grounded system like Islamic governance to gain traction or even resist effectively.
So when you add it all up, the nature of the state, the nature of Shari governance, the pressures of globalization,
you end up with what the source bluntly calls an irreconcilable deadlock.
no easy synthesis possible.
The fundamental premises are just too different. The state's self-made sovereignty versus God's sovereignty. The state's positivist law versus Shari's moral law. The exteriorized citizen versus the internally cultivated moral subject.
And the source emphasizes this isn't just an Islamic problem.
No, it's framed as a crisis within the modern project itself. A universal problem, really.
Okay. So bringing this back to the listener, what's the big takeaway here? Why should someone listening care about this seeming impossibility?
Because the deep moral and existential questions that this analysis highlights for modern Islam aren't actually exclusive to Islam.
There are questions, too.
They're embedded in the modern condition, East and West. Questions about authority, morality, the purpose of law, the nature of the self, the meaning of community. These are things everyone in the modern world grapples with, whether they realize it or not.
So understanding this specific issue sheds light on our shared situation.
Absolutely. It suggests that if we want to move towards genuinely post-Enlightenment cultures, we all of us need to critically re-examine modernity's foundations.
Like the absolute power given to human reason alone. That is thought split.
Exactly. Have these ideas, which promise liberation, actually led us to a place that feels value-free, fragmented, disconnected from deeper meaning?
Yeah.
The source prompts that kind of reflection.
So here's a final thought, something for you, the listener, to really chew on after we finish. Can societies, Muslim, non-Muslim, wherever, actually move beyond their own ingrained perspectives, their ethnocentricity, as the source puts it? Can they join ranks, in a way, to really question the modern project and the state it produced?
And if they did, what would that even look like?
Yeah, what kinds of political arrangements could possibly emerge that would genuinely protect diversity, allow different ways of life to coexist peacefully?
Arrangements based not just on power or procedure, but on a deeper shared moral understanding of what it means to be human, our place in the cosmos, our duties to each other and the world.
Where every life has inherent meaning, beyond its economic or political utility. It's a huge question, but one worth pondering.
Definitely something to think about.